An Amish man was still a virgin at 45, until the lost poor girl asked to stay in his cabin during a storm. Snow slams against the cabin walls. A lonely man, silent for decades, stares into the fire, when a desperate knock shakes his door. A shivering girl, half frozen, pleads for her life. He lets her in. And in that moment, everything changes. What begins as mercy turns into danger, because she's not just a poor girl, she's running from men who will stop at nothing to silence her. Railroad enforcers prowl the night, ready to burn, beat, and take whatever they want. Cling to his vow of peace, or risk everything to protect her. The storm may have brought her to his door, but will it also bring the fight that finally breaks him? Will a man who never touched a woman find the courage to stand against the most powerful men in the West? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the train depot as Jakob Lapp stood motionless, his plain straw hat offering little relief from the persistent heat. Sweat trickled down his neck, dampening the collar of his simple black shirt. His weathered fingers gripped his leather-bound Bible tighter as the train's whistle pierced the autumn air, announcing its arrival with a cloud of steam and iron wheels screech. Jakob's heart thundered in his chest. For weeks, he had prayed for guidance about his mail-order bride, seeking the Lord's wisdom in every quiet moment between his carpentry work. The letters they had exchanged painted a picture of a mature woman who understood the Amish way of life. But as passengers began stepping down onto the wooden platform, his careful plans crumbled like dry earth. A young girl in a faded calico dress made her way down the train steps, her movements hesitant and unsure. She was heavier than most, and her face showed the raw nervousness of youth. She couldn't have been more than 17 years old. In her arms, she clutched a small bundle wrapped in brown paper and string, her only possession from the look of it. "Mr. Lapp?" Her voice trembled as she approached him. "I'm Maria May." Jakob felt the stares of townspeople boring into them. This wasn't the woman who had written those letters. This was barely more than a child, lost and afraid. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could form words, the whispers started. "Would you look at the size of her?" came a harsh voice from behind him. "Poor Lapp," another muttered. "Surely not what he ordered." Maria's face crumpled at the cruel words, her eyes dropping to study the dusty planks beneath her feet. Jakob saw her shoulders begin to shake, and something fierce and protective rose up in his chest. Without hesitation, he stepped forward and placed a steady hand on her shoulder. "Welcome, my bride," he said, loud enough for the gossiping crowd to hear. His voice was firm, though his heart raced with uncertainty. Maria's head snapped up, her eyes wide with disbelief. Tears welled up, catching the late afternoon light. "Nobody's ever," she whispered, her voice catching. "Nobody's ever stood up for me before." Jakob felt the weight of what he'd just done settle over him. This wasn't what he had planned, but he couldn't bring himself to shame this young woman in front of the whole town. The good book taught mercy, and right now, mercy meant offering protection to someone who clearly needed it. "Come," he said softly, guiding her toward his waiting buggy. The wooden wheels creaked as they approached, and his horse nickered softly in greeting. The murmurs of the townspeople followed them like autumn leaves skittering across the ground. Jakob helped Maria up onto the wooden seat, noting how her hands trembled as she gripped the side of the buggy. Her small bundle, which he could now see contained what looked like a well-worn Bible, she kept clutched tight against her chest like a shield. As he climbed up beside her, the sun was beginning its descent behind the distant mountains, painting the Colorado sky in shades of amber and rose. The air was growing cooler, carrying the scent of pine and approaching evening. His modest homestead lay ahead, a journey of several miles along the rutted dirt road. The horse's hooves clipped steadily against the packed earth as they left the depot behind. Maria sat rigid beside him, her breathing quick and shallow. Jakob could feel the tension radiating from her, matching his own internal turmoil. This wasn't the beginning he had envisioned, but he had made a public declaration. Now they would both have to find their way forward, trusting in God's guidance through this unexpected turn of events. They rode in silence as the town fell away behind them, the whispers and stares replaced by the gentle evening sounds of crickets beginning their nightly chorus and the soft jingle of the horse's harness. Jakob stole glances at his unexpected bride, noting the way she held herself as if trying to take up as little space as possible. His heart ached at the thought of what might have driven someone so young to travel alone across the country to marry a stranger. The buggy wheels turned steadily onward, carrying them toward his homestead and an uncertain future that neither of them had anticipated when the sun rose that morning. But Jakob's words at the depot still hung in the air between them, a promise made before God and the townspeople, born of compassion rather than the careful plans he had laid. The buggy creaked along the rutted dirt road as dusk painted the Colorado sky in deepening shades of purple. Maria's hands twisted in her lap as she gathered courage to speak. The steady clip-clop of hooves against packed earth seemed to mark time between her shallow breaths. "My father," she finally began, her voice barely above a whisper. "He arranged everything. The letters, the agreement." She swallowed hard. "He wrote them all." Jakob's hands tightened on the reins, but he kept his silence, letting her words fill the cooling evening air. "He said," Maria's voice caught, "he said I was nothing but a burden. Too much to feed, too plain to find a local match." Tears traced down her cheeks, glinting in the fading light. "He took the money you sent and bought himself a new plow before putting me on that train." The horse's steady gait carried them past stands of aspen trees, their leaves rustling like whispered prayers in the evening breeze. Jakob wrestled with his disappointment, yet each quiet sob from the girl beside him stirred something deeper, a compassion that echoed the Lord's own mercy. As they crested a small rise, Jacob's homestead came into view. The cabin sat sturdy against the darkening sky, smoke curling from its stone chimney. A barn stood off to one side, and a chicken coop dozed in the gathering shadows. "Here we are," Jakob said softly, pulling the buggy to a stop. He helped Maria down, noting how she trembled like an aspen leaf in his gentle grip. Inside the cabin, lamplight cast warm shadows across the wooden walls. Maria's eyes widened as she took in the careful craftsmanship around her, each shelf and cabinet lovingly hand-carved, every joint and corner speaking of patience and skill. "You made all this?" she asked, running her fingers along a shelf's smooth edge. Jakob nodded, already busy at the hearth. "The Lord blessed me with skill for woodworking." He stirred the pot of stew he'd left simmering before his trip to town. "I hope you're hungry." They ate their simple supper in silence, hearty stew and fresh bread, while the fire popped and crackled in the hearth. Maria took small, careful bites, as if afraid to eat too much. When the bowls were empty, Jakob cleared his throat. "The loft is yours," he said, gesturing to the ladder that led to the sleeping area above. "I'll stay down here by the fire." Maria's eyes filled with fresh tears. "You're too kind, Mr. Lapp. I don't deserve—" "Please," he interrupted gently. "Call me Jakob." As evening prayers approached, they knelt together before the hearth. Maria's shoulders shook as she fought back sobs. "I don't understand," she whispered. "Why are you being so kind to me? I'm not worthy of such treatment." Jakob turned to face her, his expression gentle in the firelight. "In God's eyes, every soul has worth," he said firmly. "Every single one. The good book teaches us that the Lord's mercy extends to all his children, not just those the world deems worthy." Maria ducked her head, but not before Jakob caught the wonder in her tear-filled eyes. After prayers, she climbed the ladder to the loft, her small bundle clutched tight against her chest. The night settled deep around the cabin. From above came the soft sounds of Maria crying into her blanket, each muffled sob a testament to years of hurt and rejection. Jacob lay on his bedroll near the hearth, eyes fixed on the dancing flames. What was God's purpose in sending this wounded child to his door? He had prayed for a wife, for partnership in building a godly home. Instead, the Lord had sent him someone in desperate need of protection and healing. The fire burned low as Jacob's thoughts turned to tomorrow. There would be talk in town, he knew. Questions about the young girl who had arrived instead of his intended bride. But hadn't the good book taught that true faith showed itself in works of mercy? As the last embers pulsed orange in the darkness, Jacob found himself praying, not for answers, but for guidance, for wisdom to know how best to help this wounded soul the Lord had placed in his care. When the roosters announced the arrival of dawn, Jacob was already awake. He stirred the banked coals, adding kindling until fresh flames licked upward. The familiar rhythm of morning chores beckoned, animals to feed, water to draw, eggs to gather. Through the small window, the first rays of sunlight painted the eastern sky in shades of promise, while overhead, the soft sounds of Maria's breathing spoke of peaceful sleep at last. The morning sun cast long shadows across Jacob's yard as his axe bit steadily into chunks of pine. Sweat dampened his shirt despite the autumn chill. The rhythmic thunk of splitting wood filled the crisp air. The cabin door creaked open. Maria stood hesitantly on the threshold, her shawl pulled tight against the morning cold. She watched him work for a moment before gathering her courage. Could I help with the chores?" Her voice was soft but determined. Jacob paused, axe resting on the chopping block. "Yeah, there is always work to be done." He gestured toward the chicken coop. "The hens need feeding, if you're willing." Maria nodded eagerly and headed for the feed bucket. Her hands trembled as she scooped the grain, spilling some on the ground. The chickens fluttered around her feet, pecking eagerly. She jumped at their sudden movement but steadied herself, continuing to scatter feed with careful determination. Jacob watched from the corner of his eye as he stacked wood. Her movements were uncertain, but she didn't give up. When she finished with the chickens, he led her to the barn. "The goats need fresh hay," he explained, showing her how to fill their mangers. "And here's where we store the milk pails for morning milking." Maria listened intently, her face serious with concentration. Though her movements were clumsy, her eagerness to learn touched something in Jacob's heart. Here was someone who truly wanted to help, to belong. As the sun climbed higher, they settled at the rough-hewn table for the midday meal. Maria had managed to bake a fresh loaf of bread, though it was slightly burned on one side. She watched anxiously as Jacob took a bite. "It's good," he said honestly. The burnt crust couldn't hide the bread's wholesome flavor. A smile started to bloom on Maria's face, but it vanished at the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Jacob rose quickly, moving to the window. A rider was coming fast up the road. It was Thomas Weber, their nearest neighbor. His horse was lathered, suggesting he'd ridden hard. Jacob stepped outside to meet him, Maria hovering uncertainly in the doorway. "Jacob," Thomas called, reining his horse to a stop. "Thought you should know. There's a man in Red Rock asking about your place. Says he's looking for his daughter." Thomas glanced at Maria, his expression grave. Been bragging in the saloon about taking her back, making some deal with the owner. Maria made a small, frightened sound. All color had drained from her face. "What deal?" Jacob asked, though dread was already settling in his chest. Maria's voice shook. "He promised, mister. Carlton, he could have me. For the saloon." Her words came out in a rush now. "That's why I ran. Why I answered your letter instead. I couldn't bear." Jacob's hands clenched into fists. The very thought of someone treating a child of God like common property made his blood run cold. "Thank you for the warning, Thomas," he said firmly. "The girl stays here, under my protection." After Thomas rode away, Jacob found Maria trembling by the hearth. "He won't take you," Jacob assured her, his voice gentle but firm. You're safe here." Maria looked up at him, her eyes brimming with tears. "No one," she whispered. "No one has ever said I was worth protecting before." "Then they were wrong," Jacob replied simply. "You have worth beyond measure in God's eyes. And in mine." The rest of the day passed quietly, though Jacob noticed how Maria kept glancing nervously toward the window. As evening settled in, they sat in the warm glow of the lamp, reading from Scripture. The familiar words seemed to calm Maria's fears, though worry still creased her brow. After evening prayers, Jacob heard Maria climb the ladder to the loft. He waited a while, listening to the settling sounds of the house before rising to check on her. Standing on the ladder's upper rungs, he could just see into the loft. Maria lay curled on her side, already deep in sleep. Her shawl was clutched tight against her chest like a child's comfort blanket. In sleep, her face had lost its worried look, appearing younger and more vulnerable than ever. Jacob stood there silently, watching her peaceful breathing. A fierce protectiveness welled up inside him. This girl, this brave, wounded soul, had been placed in his care. Whatever her father might try, Jacob would not let any harm come to her. God had brought her to his door, and he would guard her as if she were his own flesh and blood. The next morning dawned clear but chilly. Jacob hitched the horse to the wagon, while Maria wrapped her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders. They needed supplies from town, though Jacob knew the visit would stir talk. The wooden wheels creaked as they rolled down the rutted road toward Miller's Creek. The streets were already bustling when they arrived. Women in their Sunday best hurried between shops, and men gathered outside the general store. As Jacob helped Maria down from the wagon, he noticed the sudden hush that fell over nearby conversations. Two women standing near the millinery shop whispered behind their handkerchiefs, their eyes fixed on Maria. Hardly what anyone expected for Jacob Lapp. One murmured, loud enough to carry, "And so young!" Jacob placed a protective hand on Maria's shoulder, steering her toward the general store. The bell above the door tinkled as they entered, but Mr. Peterson, usually quick with a greeting, barely looked up from his ledger. "We need flour and sugar," Jacob said firmly, setting his list on the counter. "And thread, if you have any." Mr. Peterson's eyes flicked to Maria, then away. "Flour's gone up," he said shortly. "Not sure I can—" "We will pay what is fair," Jacob interrupted, his quiet voice carrying authority. "This is my wife, Mr. Peterson. In the eyes of God and man, she deserves the same courtesy you show any customer." The storekeeper's face reddened, but he nodded stiffly and began gathering their items. Maria stood straighter, though her cheeks burned pink at Jacob's words. As they loaded supplies into their wagon, Maria's hands trembled slightly, but she insisted on carrying a heavy sack of flour herself. "Thank you," she whispered when they were alone, "for speaking up like that." Jacob nodded, his expression gentle. "It is only right." Their next stop was the blacksmith's shop, where Jacob needed horseshoes. While Maria waited with the wagon, he spoke with Tom Miller, the smith. As Tom heated iron in his forge, he glanced around before speaking low. "Heard something you should know, Jacob. That father of hers, he's hired help. 2 rough fellows from up Red Rock way. Been asking directions to Amish farms." Jacob's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice steady. "Much obliged for the warning." The wind picked up on their drive home, carrying the bite of coming winter. Jacob noticed Maria shivering beneath her thin shawl, her face pale with cold. Without a word, he shrugged off his heavy wool coat and draped it over her shoulders. Maria looked up, startled by the gesture. "But won't you be cold?" "I am used to it," Jacob replied simply. She pulled the coat closer, breathing in the scent of wool and wood smoke. Though she'd endured countless stares and whispers in town, her eyes now held a quiet dignity. Jacob found himself admiring her strength, how she faced each slight with grace, never complaining. The sun was setting when they reached home. While Jacob tended to the horse, Maria hurried inside to start supper. The kitchen soon filled with the smell of baking biscuits. They were oddly shaped, some too flat and others nearly burned, but Maria had clearly tried her best. "These are good," Jacob said when they sat down to eat. And he meant it. The biscuits might not have been perfect, but they were made with care. Maria's face brightened at the praise. My mother taught me a little before. She trailed off, then added softly, I want to learn to do better. After the dishes were cleaned, they settled in their usual places by the fire. Maria took up her mending while Jacob read from his Bible. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls, and a comfortable silence fell between them. It was different from the awkward quiet of their first days. Something gentler had taken root. Jacob glanced up from his reading to find Maria focused intently on her stitching, her face peaceful in the firelight. Though she still started at sudden sounds and watched the windows anxiously, there was a growing steadiness to her presence. She was no longer the frightened girl who had stepped off the train. The evening passed quietly, broken only by the crack of burning wood and the soft whisper of turning pages. Neither spoke of the rumors heard in town or the threats that might be coming. For now, it was enough to share this moment of peace, this fragile trust building between them like a bridge across uncertain waters. The autumn days slipped by like leaves drifting on the wind. Maria rose earlier each morning, determined to learn the rhythms of farm life. In the dim light of dawn, Jacob found her already at the barn door, ready to help with chores despite her obvious nervousness around the animals. The cow won't hurt you, Jacob assured her, demonstrating how to position the milk pail. Just be gentle and firm. Maria's first attempts at milking resulted in more spills than success. The cow shifted restlessly, and Maria yelped as her uncertain hands lost their grip. But then something unexpected happened. She laughed. The sound, bright and genuine, echoed in the barn's dusty air. Jacob looked up, startled. It was the first time he'd heard her truly laugh, and something warm stirred in his chest at the sound. I reckon I'm not much of a milkmaid, Maria said, wiping her damp hands on her apron. But she didn't give up. Each morning, she tried again, her movements becoming more confident. Their days fell into a steady pattern. After morning chores came breakfast, simple fare of porridge or eggs, with Maria learning to bake bread that grew less dense with each attempt. Jacob found himself watching her as she worked, noting how her face relaxed when she thought no one was looking. Her quiet humor emerged in small ways, a quirked smile when the chickens squabbled over feed, a soft chuckle when she managed to collect eggs without getting pecked. Sunday arrived clear and cool. Maria dressed carefully in her best dress, though it was plain compared to the other women's traditional clothing. Jacob helped her into the buggy, sensing her anxiety as they drove toward the meeting house. Bishop Eli Yoda stood at the door, his stern face creasing deeper at the sight of them. His eyes lingered on Maria's unfamiliar ways, how she held her hands, the slight hesitation in her step. Welcome, the bishop said, though his tone carried little warmth. We trust you will observe our ways with proper respect. Maria ducked her head. Yes, sir, thank you. Inside, the wooden benches were hard and unforgiving. As the service began, Jacob felt the weight of tradition pressing down like a heavy mantle. The Ordnung, their community's strict rules, demanded complete obedience. Every hymn, every prayer, every gesture was prescribed by generations of practice. Maria sat perfectly still beside him, trying to follow along, but her movements were clearly unpracticed. Women in traditional dress whispered behind raised hands. Men cast sideways glances that spoke of judgment. After the service, Elder Samuel Miller drew Jacob aside, his voice low but firm. Brother Lapp, we must speak of this situation. Taking in an outsider, one who knows nothing of our ways, it brings dishonor to the community. Jacob opened his mouth to respond, but movement caught his eye. Maria stood frozen nearby, her face pale as she overheard the elder's words. Before Jacob could reach her, she turned and hurried toward the buggy, her shoulders trembling. The ride home was silent, save for the clip-clop of hooves and the creak of wheels. When they reached the cabin, Maria's composure finally broke. I'm so sorry, she whispered, twisting her hands in her lap. I never meant to cause trouble for you. Perhaps, Perhaps I should go. Jakob turned to her, his voice gentle but firm. No, you will stay. But your people, God calls us to show mercy. Jakob said, I will not turn you away. That evening, after Maria had gone up to the loft, Jakob knelt by the fireplace. The flames cast dancing shadows as he bowed his head in prayer, wrestling with the conflict in his heart. The Ordnung had guided his life since birth, its rules as familiar as breathing, yet something deeper pulled at him, a certainty that protecting Maria was right in God's eyes, even if it challenged tradition. Lord, he whispered, grant me wisdom. Show me the path of true righteousness. The fire crackled softly, and somewhere in the night, an owl called. Jakob remained on his knees, seeking answers in the quiet of his heart. Above in the loft, he heard Maria's soft movements as she prepared for bed, and he knew with growing certainty that whatever challenges lay ahead, he would face them with the strength of his convictions. Through the window, stars wheeled in the vast prairie sky, unchanged by the small dramas playing out beneath them. Jakob finally rose, his knees stiff, but his spirit settled into quiet resolve. Whatever judgment the community might pass, he would stand firm in his choice to offer shelter to one in need. Morning sunlight streamed through the cabin windows as Maria hesitated near Jacob's workbench. He was measuring a plank of pine, his movements precise and practiced. The scent of fresh sawdust filled the air. Might I? Maria twisted her apron in her hands. Might I help you with your carpentry work? Jakob paused, pencil hovering over wood. He had never considered sharing his craft with anyone, let alone his unexpected bride. Yet something in her eager expression made him reconsider. It takes years to learn proper woodworking, he said gently. But perhaps... He glanced around and spotted some rough planks that needed smoothing. You could help with the sanding? Maria's face brightened. Jakob showed her how to hold the sanding block, demonstrating the proper motion, steady and even, following the grain of the wood. To his surprise, she took to the task with careful attention. Like this? She asked, moving the block in slow, methodical strokes. Yeah, exactly so. Jakob watched as she worked, noting her patient approach. Her hands, though unused to such labor, remained steady. She didn't rush or grow frustrated when the work proved tedious. The morning passed quietly, broken only by the whisper of sand against wood and the distant call of autumn birds. Cold wind rattled the windows, carrying the promise of winter, but inside the workshop stayed warm from their shared efforts. As they paused for a mid-morning rest, Maria spoke softly. My mother taught me to read and write before she passed. She glanced at Jakob, as if unsure how he would receive this information. She believed every person should know their letters, even girls. Jakob nodded thoughtfully. Reading was not common among his people. Many considered too much learning a path to pride. But he had often wished he could study scripture for himself, instead of relying solely on others' interpretation. Would you? Maria hesitated. Would you like me to read to you from the good book? Jakob retrieved his Bible from its shelf, handling it with reverence before passing it to her. Maria opened it carefully, her fingers tracing the verses until she found a familiar passage. When she began to read, her voice trembled at first, but grew stronger with each word. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want, she read, the familiar psalm taking on new beauty in her clear voice. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. Jakob closed his eyes, letting the words wash over him. He had heard these verses hundreds of times, yet somehow they felt different now, more immediate, more personal. Maria's voice carried both gentleness and strength, bringing the scripture to life in their small cabin. As evening approached, Jakob remembered the land deed petition he needed to write. Railroad men had been pressing at the edges of Amish territory, and the community needed to secure their claims. I struggle with such formal writing, he admitted, showing her the rough draft he had attempted. Maria studied his work, then took up the pen with quiet confidence. Perhaps we could word it this way, she suggested, beginning to write in a neat, clear hand. Her knowledge of proper English phrases surprised and impressed him. Together they crafted the petition, Maria's skill with words complementing Jakob's understanding of the land issues. Several times their collaboration brought unexpected moments of laughter over Jakob's creative spelling attempts or Maria's careful corrections. "I never thought these skills would be of use," Maria confessed as she finished the final paragraph. The lantern cast a warm glow over her face, softer now with happiness. "Father always said reading was a waste of time for someone like me." "Someone like you?" Jakob questioned gently. "Someone." Maria gestured vaguely at herself, her usual insecurity showing through. "Someone plain and ordinary." "You are neither plain nor ordinary," Jakob said firmly. "God gives each person different gifts. Your mother was wise to teach you." Maria's eyes glistened in the lamplight. "This is the first time I have felt—" She searched for the right word. "Useful. Truly useful." Jakob watched as she carefully sealed the completed petition. Her hands, still dusty from sanding that morning, moved with quiet purpose. He thought about how God's plans often unfurled in unexpected ways. What had seemed at first a burden, taking in this young woman who arrived in place of his intended bride, was revealing itself as something else entirely. As the night deepened around their cabin, the wind singing in the eaves, Jakob realized that Maria brought more than just her presence to his home. She brought gifts he had never known he needed, patience in learning his craft, literacy to help with business matters, and a fresh way of seeing familiar scriptures. The days flowed together like a gentle stream, each one bringing Jakob and Maria closer through their shared work. The autumn air grew crisper, carrying the scent of pine and approaching winter as they settled into an easy rhythm. Jakob found himself watching Maria as she fed the chickens or helped him in the workshop, noting how her movements had grown more confident, her smile appearing more readily. One evening, as Jakob sat on the cabin's front step sharpening his tools, the rasp of stone against metal steady in the gathering dusk, Maria settled beside him. Her hands twisted in her lap, a gesture he had come to recognize as a sign of worry. "What troubles you?" Jakob asked softly, setting aside his work. Maria's voice quivered. "I keep thinking about Father." She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "Every time I hear horses on the road, my heart stops. He won't give up easily, Jakob. He never has." Jakob set down his whetstone and turned to face her. "You are safe here," he said firmly. "This is your home now, and I will protect you." "But what if—" Maria's words caught in her throat. "No harm will come to you while you are under my roof," Jakob assured her, though unease settled in his stomach like a heavy stone. He had heard more whispers in town about Maria's father and his hired men, none of them good. That night the sky spread vast and clear above the homestead, stars pricking through the darkness like pinhole lanterns. Jakob had just banked the fire when Maria's frightened voice called from the loft. "Jakob, I hear horses!" He grabbed his lantern and moved quickly to the window. The flame's glow caught something white fluttering near the barn, a piece of paper nailed to the door. His heart pounding, Jakob pulled on his boots and coat. "Stay inside," he told Maria, who had descended the loft ladder, her face pale in the dim light. The night air bit through his clothing as Jakob crossed the yard. He lifted the lantern, its light revealing crude words scratched across the paper. "She comes with us by week's end, or you'll hang for stealing her." A sound like distant thunder made him turn. Orange flames licked up the back of the barn, spreading fast across the dry wood. Jakob ran for the water pump, but he knew with sinking certainty it was already too late. The fire roared through the structure, consuming hay and timber with terrifying speed. He worked through the night, fighting the blaze with bucket after bucket of water, but by dawn only smoking ruins remained. The morning light revealed the full extent of the destruction: blackened beams, melted tools, and the acrid smell of ash hanging heavy in the air. Maria stood in the cabin doorway, her face streaked with tears as she took in the devastating scene. "This is my fault," she whispered, her voice breaking. "All my fault. I should never have come here." Jacob crossed to her quickly, his clothes still smelling of smoke. "No," he said firmly, taking her trembling hands in his. "You are not to blame for evil acts done by others. But your barn, your tools, everything you've worked for." Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. "Buildings can be rebuilt," Jacob said softly. "Tools can be replaced." He squeezed her hands gently. "This is your home now, Maria. Nothing they do will change that. I promise to protect you, and I mean to keep that promise, no matter the cost." Maria's eyes met his, filled with a mix of gratitude and fear. "Why would you do this for me?" "Risk so much." "Because it is right." Jacob answered simply. "Because you deserve to be safe, to be valued." The wind picked up, carrying the first bitter chill of winter. Jacob surveyed the smouldering ruins with determined eyes, mentally cataloguing what could be salvaged. "I need to see what tools might be recovered," he said. "Will you be all right inside?" Maria nodded, wiping her eyes with her apron. "I will pray," she said quietly. "It's all I know to do right now." Jacob watched her disappear into the cabin before turning back to the charred remains of his barn. As he carefully picked through the ashes, looking for anything that might be saved, he could hear Maria's soft voice through the cabin window, lifted in earnest prayer. The sound gave him strength as he worked, reminder of what and who he was fighting to protect. The morning wore on, winter winds sweeping across the homestead, carrying away the last wisps of smoke. Jacob's hands grew black with soot as he retrieved what tools he could from the ruins. Each time he glanced toward the cabin, he could see Maria through the window, her head bowed in continued prayer, her lips moving in silent supplication for their safety. The morning after the fire dawned harsh and cold, a steel-grey sky hanging low over the homestead. Thin wisps of smoke still rose from the barn's blackened skeleton, carrying the bitter scent of destruction on the wind. Jacob had been up since before first light, his broad shoulders bent as he sorted through the wreckage, setting aside what might be salvaged. Maria watched him from the cabin door, her heart aching. When she brought him a cup of water, he paused only long enough to take a few swallows before returning to his work. "Let me help," she said softly, reaching for a fallen board. Jacob hesitated, then nodded. "Mind the nails," he warned. "They'll be everywhere in the ashes." Together they worked through the morning, Maria gathering bent nails into her apron while Jacob assessed the damage. She made countless trips to the well, bringing fresh water for both drinking and dousing the occasional smouldering timber that still glowed beneath the ruins. Around midday, the first of the neighbors began arriving. Sarah Yoder brought fresh bread and sympathy, while her husband Samuel offered to help clear debris. But others came too, their faces darker with judgment than concern. "Trouble follows some folks," Elder Miller said pointedly, his eyes fixed on Maria. "Perhaps this is the Lord's way of showing what happens when we stray from the Ordnung." Maria's cheeks burned as she hurried inside the cabin, but she could still hear Jacob's firm response through the window. "She is my wife," he declared, his quiet voice carrying the weight of certainty. "And any trouble that comes to her comes to me by choice." More neighbors arrived throughout the afternoon. Some brought food or offered help, while others stood at a distance, whispering among themselves. Maria tried to make herself useful, serving coffee to those who worked and trying, to ignore the sideways glances and murmured conversations that fell silent when she drew near. As evening approached, she climbed the ladder to store some blankets in the loft. Through the floorboards, she heard heavy boots on the cabin steps and Jacob's voice speaking to someone outside. "You need to send her away, Jacob," a man urged. "Her father's got dangerous friends." "This won't end well." "Then let it end with me," Jacob replied, his voice steel-strong despite its softness. "I would die before I'd hand her over to those men." Maria pressed her hands to her mouth, stifling a sob. She huddled in the loft's shadows as the conversation continued below, each word of Jacob's loyalty cutting deeper into her heart. He spoke of protection and duty, of God's calling to shelter those in need. But all Maria could think of was the smoking ruin of his barn, the whispers of the neighbors, and now this threat to his very life. When she finally descended, Jacob had prepared a simple supper of bread and stew. They ate in silence, the weight of the day settling between them like a heavy blanket. After the meal, Jacob knelt by the hearth as he did each evening. "Lord," he prayed aloud, his voice carrying clearly in the quiet cabin, "guide our steps in this time of trouble. Show us the path of righteousness, and grant us the strength to walk it faithfully." Maria watched him through tear-blurred eyes, his dedication to prayer unchanged despite all that had happened. As he continued his devotions, she made her decision. She could not allow this good man to suffer further for her sake. That night, she lay awake in the loft, listening to Jacob's steady breathing below. She waited until the fire had died to barely glowing embers, and the first hint of pre-dawn grey touched the window. Moving with painful slowness, she crept down the ladder, each creak of wood making her freeze in fear of waking him. Jacob slept soundly, exhausted from the previous day's labor. In the dim light, Maria could see the soot still marking his strong hands, the worry lines etched deeper in his face. Her heart clenched at the sight of him, this man who had shown her more kindness in a few weeks than she had known in all her years before. She gathered her few belongings, the shawl her mother had made, her precious Bible, a change of clothes, wrapping them in a small bundle. On the table she left a note written in her careful hand. "I cannot let you die for me. God bless you for your kindness." The door latch lifted silently under her trembling fingers. As she stepped out into the biting pre-dawn air, Maria paused for one last look at the cabin that had so briefly been her home. Tears froze on her cheeks as she turned away, her feet carrying her down the rutted road and away from the only place she had ever felt truly safe. Behind her, smoke still rose from the barn's ruins, a stark reminder of the destruction her presence had brought. The morning star hung low on the horizon as Maria May slipped away into the darkness, believing that her departure was the only gift she could offer, the man who had risked everything to protect her. Jacob woke with the first rays of dawn streaming through the cabin windows. Something felt wrong. The usual soft sounds of Maria stirring in the loft were missing. He climbed the ladder, his heart already knowing what he would find. An empty sleeping pallet and Maria's things gone. "Maria!" he called, though the stillness of the cabin told him she wasn't there. On the table below lay a folded piece of paper. His hands trembled as he read her neat writing. "I cannot let you die for me. God bless you for your kindness." Panic seized his chest. Without bothering to eat, Jacob threw on his coat and ran to the stable. His horse nickered. As he hastily fitted the saddle, his fingers clumsy with fear. The morning air bit through his clothes as he urged his mount down the rutted road, scanning the frozen ground for tracks. The wind had risen, whipping his plain coat around him as he rode. Every few minutes he pulled his horse to a stop, calling Maria's name into the emptiness. Only the whistling wind answered back. He passed Eli Miller's farm, then the Weber place, asking each if they'd seen her. "Seen a girl walking toward town just after sunrise," old Mr. Weber finally told him, leaning on his fence post. "Looking mighty cold and tired, she was." Jacob spurred his horse faster, his heart pounding. He met the Hamilton brothers driving their wagon and pulled up beside them. "Have you seen a young woman walking alone?" "In a dark dress." The older brother nodded. "Passed her about an hour back, heading toward the saloon district, looked like. Ice formed in Jacob's stomach. He knew that's where Maria's father would be looking for her." The horse's hooves thundered against the frozen ground as he pushed on, praying he wasn't too late. Meanwhile, Maria stumbled along the road, her feet aching and her thin dress no match for the bitter wind. She had walked for hours, trying to put distance between herself and Jacob's homestead. Her legs trembled with exhaustion. The sound of approaching horses made her heart skip. Before she could hide, 3 riders surrounded her, her father and 2 rough-looking men she didn't know. Her father's face was twisted with rage as he dismounted. "Thought you could run away, did you?" He grabbed her arm roughly. "Get up here! Please!" Maria begged as the men dragged her toward one of the horses. "Just let me go." "That Amish fool won't come for you," her father sneered, forcing her onto his saddle. "He's too yellow to fight. You're going where you belong." They rode hard toward town, Maria bouncing painfully against the saddle horn. Tears froze on her cheeks as she thought of Jakob, praying he would understand why she had left. The sun was setting when they clattered into town, casting long shadows between the buildings. Her father yanked her down from the horse, his grip bruising as he dragged her toward the garish lights of the saloon. A crowd began to gather, drawn by the commotion. "Got my property back," her father announced loudly, pulling Maria forward like a prized animal. "And there's a buyer waiting." Maria struggled weakly, but hours of walking had left her drained. The saloon's lamp cast yellow light across the gathering faces, some concerned, others merely curious, none stepping forward to help. Then she heard it, the steady clip-clop of an approaching horse. The crowd parted, and there was Jakob, his usually gentle face set in lines of determination. He dismounted slowly, Bible clutched in one hand and a sturdy axe handle in the other. His eyes met Maria's, and she saw the conflict there, the peaceful man of God wrestling with the need to protect what was his. He stood straight and tall in his plain black coat, the lamplight catching the sweat on his brow despite the cold. "Let her go," Jakob said, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet street. The axe handle hung loose at his side, but his knuckles were white where they gripped it. Her father laughed harshly. "Or what? You'll pray at me. She's my daughter, and I'll do what I want with her." Jakob took a step forward, and Maria could see the struggle in his face, his Amish beliefs against violence warring with his desperate need to save her. The crowd pressed closer, eager to see what this quiet man would do. The Bible in Jacob's left hand seemed to weigh as heavy as the axe handle in his right, each representing a different path. Maria watched him, hardly daring to breathe, as he stood at the edge of that lamplit circle, caught between his pacifist vows and the cry of his heart to act. The crowd on Main Street swelled as the commotion grew. Maria's father maintained his cruel grip on her arm, dragging her forward like a prized cow at auction. The setting sun cast long shadows between the buildings, turning the dusty street into a stage for the unfolding drama. "Look at her," her father bellowed, giving Maria a rough shake. "Too fat to be any man's proper wife, but folks'll pay good money to gawk." His words carried across the gathering crowd, drawing cruel laughter from some of the coarser elements. Maria's chin dropped to her chest, hot tears of shame rolling down her cheeks. The worn fabric of her dress seemed to shrink around her, making her feel even more exposed to the jeering faces. Some of the townswomen whispered behind their hands, while others turned away, unwilling to witness such cruelty. Jakob stood at the edge of the crowd, his normally gentle face hardened with purpose. The Bible in his left hand caught the last rays of sunlight as he stepped forward, his boots striking the packed earth with deliberate force. "Enough!" His voice rang out, carrying an authority that silenced the crowd. Even those who had been laughing fell quiet, surprised by the commanding tone from the usually soft-spoken Amish man. "Maria May is my lawful bride," Jakob declared, his words clear and strong, despite the slight tremor in his hands. "She is not property to be sold or bartered. She is a child of God, worthy of dignity and respect." Maria's father spat in the dirt, his face twisted with contempt. "Dignity? Respect? She's my daughter, and I've got expenses to cover. You took her without paying proper dowry. $500, that's what I'm owed!" He yanked Maria's arm again, making her whimper. "Pay up, or I'll have my men teach you about respect." The two rough men who had helped capture Maria stepped closer, cracking their knuckles menacingly. The crowd shifted uneasily, sensing violence in the air. Jakob's hand trembled as he reached into his coat. He withdrew a leather pouch that clinked heavily as he held it up. "This represents every dollar I've saved over 10 years of honest work," he said, his voice thick with emotion. $342 in silver and gold. Every penny I set aside for tools, for lumber, for my future." A shocked murmur rippled through the gathering. Even Maria's father's eyes widened at the sight of the bulging purse. "I offer it freely," Jakob continued, "not because Maria is property to be purchased, but to free her from your cruel claim." He stepped forward and placed the pouch carefully in the dirt between them. The sound of coins settling seemed to echo in the hushed street. The townsfolk began to stir, moved by Jakob's sacrifice. "Shame!" someone called from the crowd. "Shame on you, Samuel May!" Others took up the cry, their voices rising in anger at the father's cruelty. "You'd sell your own flesh and blood? The man's offering his life savings. This ain't right, and you know it!" Heavy boot steps sounded on the wooden sidewalk as Marshal Dan O'Malley pushed through the crowd, his badge catching the last light of day. His weathered face was grim as he surveyed the scene. "Samuel May!" The marshal's voice cut through the noise like a knife. "I've heard enough to charge you with attempted trafficking. We've got laws against selling human beings in this territory." Maria's father's face purpled with rage. "You can't." "I can, and I will." The marshal nodded to his deputy, who stepped forward with iron manacles. "You're under arrest for attempting to sell your daughter into bondage. That's a federal offense." The deputy clapped the irons around Samuel May's wrists. He thrashed and cursed, spitting threats at Jakob and Maria. The marshal nodded to several townsmen who stepped forward to help escort the prisoner, along with his 2 hired men, toward the jail. Maria, finally free of her father's grip, swayed on her feet. The strain of the day's terror and exhaustion caught up with her all at once. She stumbled forward, and Jakob caught her in his arms as she collapsed, weeping into the rough wool of his coat. "You came for me," she sobbed, her fingers clutching his lapels. "You gave up everything." Jakob held her gently, one hand stroking her hair as he had seen mothers comfort their children. "Not everything," he murmured. "I have what matters most right here." The crowd began to disperse, leaving them standing in the growing dusk. The leather purse still lay in the dirt, forgotten, as Jakob supported his bride, her tears slowly soaking into his coat while the last light faded from the western sky. The crowd's murmurs faded behind them as Jakob guided Maria away from the main street. His gentle hand at her elbow steadied her trembling steps as they made their way toward the white-painted church that stood sentinel at the edge of town. The evening air grew crisp, carrying the scent of wood smoke and approaching winter. A single lamp burned outside the church door, its yellow glow creating a pool of light in the gathering dusk. Dead leaves skittered across the packed earth of the churchyard as Jakob led Maria to a wooden bench beneath the lamp. Her breath came in hiccuping gasps, the aftermath of tears still evident on her flushed cheeks. "I thought—" Maria's voice was barely above a whisper, her hands twisting in her lap. "I thought I was nothing but trouble for you. A burden God sent to test your patience." She lifted her face to his, eyes shining with fresh tears. "Yet you called me your bride before everyone. You gave up all you had." The lamplight caught the planes of Jakob's face as he turned toward her. His usual stern expression had softened, showing the gentle heart that lay beneath his quiet exterior. "I confess that when you first stepped off that train, I doubted God's wisdom," he said softly. "I wondered why he would send me someone so different from what I expected." Maria's shoulders hunched slightly at his words, but Jakob reached out and took her hand in his work-roughened one. "But God has shown me the truth, Maria. You are no burden. You are his gift to me. Your kindness, your determination to learn our ways, your clever mind with letters and numbers." His voice grew thick with emotion. "Even your courage to leave, thinking to spare me harm. These are not the actions of a curse, but of a blessing." Tears spilled freely down Maria's cheeks now, but they were different from the tears of shame and fear she had shed earlier. These were tears of relief, of joy, of belonging at last. Jakob guided her gently to her knees beside him in the churchyard, the packed earth cool beneath them. "Let us pray together," he said quietly, "and ask for strength to begin anew." Their heads bowed in the lamplight as Jakob's deep voice rose in prayer. Lord, we thank you for your wisdom that surpasses our understanding. Guide us as we build our life together, and grant us the strength to face whatever trials may come. Maria's softer voice joined his. Thank you for sending me to this good man, who sees me through your eyes of love. As they rose from prayer, several townspeople approached through the growing darkness. Mrs. Anderson, the baker's wife, stepped forward with concern, etched on her kind face. You shouldn't go back to your homestead tonight, she urged. Not after what happened. Stay with us where it's safe. Other neighbors added their voices, offering shelter and protection, but Jakob shook his head firmly. We thank you for your kindness, he said, his voice carrying quiet authority, but we will return home together. Evil cannot drive us from where God has planted us. The ride home in Jacob's buggy was quiet, broken only by the steady clip-clop of the horse's hooves and the creak of wooden wheels. The initial tension gradually melted away as Maria found herself leaning against Jakob's solid shoulder, her exhaustion finally catching up with her. Above them, stars pierced the velvet darkness of the sky, countless points of light declaring God's glory. The familiar silhouette of their cabin emerged from the darkness, a solid shape against the star-filled sky. Jacob helped Maria down from the buggy, his hands gentle but sure at her waist. Inside, the cabin was cold and dark, but Jacob moved with purpose, striking a match to light the lamp before kneeling at the hearth. As he built up the fire, the flames caught and grew, sending warmth and light spreading through the small space. Maria watched him work, remembering how those same hands had held out his life savings without hesitation to free her from her father's cruelty. Jakob stood from the crackling fire and turned to face her, his expression solemn yet tender in the firelight. No evil will ever drive you from my side again, Maria, he declared, his voice carrying the weight of a sacred vow. This is your home, and I am your husband in truth as well as word. The firelight danced across the cabin walls as they stood together, casting their joined shadows against the rough-hewn logs, no longer two uncertain strangers thrown together by circumstance, but two souls united by God's providence and their own choosing. Dawn broke over the homestead, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and gold. Jacob and Maria emerged from the cabin into the crisp morning air, their breath forming small clouds in the cold. The charred remains of the barn stood as a stark reminder of recent troubles, but today would mark a new beginning. Jakob hefted his toolbox while Maria carried a bucket of nails. They had just begun clearing away debris when the sound of wagon wheels caught their attention. To their surprise, 3 buggies approached down the rutted road, loaded with lumber and tools. "Thought you might need some help, neighbor?" called Samuel Miller, climbing down from his wagon. His wife Sarah followed, carrying a basket covered with a checkered cloth. Behind them, more families appeared, the Yoders, the Stoltzfuses, and even some English neighbors from town. Maria hung back shyly as the wagons unloaded, but Sarah Miller approached her with a warm smile. "Here," she said, pressing a fresh loaf of bread into Maria's hands. "Every barn raising needs good food to keep the workers strong." Tears welled in Maria's eyes at this simple kindness. "Thank you," she whispered, clutching the bread close. The morning air soon filled with the sounds of work, hammers pounding, saws rasping, men calling measurements to each other. Jakob directed the effort with quiet authority, his carpenter's eye ensuring every beam stood true. Maria moved among the workers, offering water and helping where she could. Children darted between the busy adults, turning the worksite into a festival of activity. Little Hannah Yoder tugged at Maria's skirt, offering her a wildflower picked from the meadow's edge. Maria's face lit up as she accepted the small gift, tucking it into her apron pocket. As the sun climbed toward noon, the barn's new frame began taking shape against the autumn sky. The men paused for their midday meal, gathering in the shade of a large oak tree. Maria had spread quilts on the ground, where the women laid out their baskets of food. "Perhaps," Maria's voice was hesitant as she addressed the group, "perhaps I could read something while you rest?" She held her mother's Bible close, uncertain of their response. Jacob nodded encouragingly. Please do, Maria. Opening to the book of Psalms, Maria began reading in a clear, steady voice. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Her words carried across the gathering, and gradually all conversation ceased as people listened. Even the children grew still, caught by the beauty of the familiar words spoken with such feeling. When she finished, several women wiped tears from their eyes. You have a gift, child, Sarah Miller said softly. We are blessed to hear God's word through you. The afternoon brought more progress as the barn walls rose steadily. Maria noticed how differently people treated her now. Gone were the suspicious glances and whispered comments. Instead, women included her in their conversations, sharing recipes and household advice. Children brought her their small treasures, pretty stones and feathers, which she admired with genuine delight. As evening approached, Maria bustled about the cabin, preparing a hearty stew with vegetables the neighbors had brought. The small space filled with the savory aroma of cooking, mingled with the sound of laughter and conversation as workers came in to warm themselves. This stew is a blessing, Samuel Miller declared, accepting a second bowl. The Lord has given you a good wife, Jacob. Jacob's eyes met Maria's across the crowded room, his quiet smile speaking volumes. She ducked her head, cheeks flushing with pleasure at the praise. The sun had set by the time the last wagon departed, leaving behind a barn frame that stood proud and strong against the darkening sky. Jacob and Maria sat together by the hearth, the familiar crackle of the fire filling the comfortable silence between them. I never thought, Maria began softly. I never imagined I could belong somewhere like this. Jacob took her hand gently in his. God has blessed us with good neighbors, he said, and he blessed me with you. He paused, choosing his words carefully. Once the barn is finished, I would like us to be properly wed, before God and our community. Maria's eyes shone in the firelight as she squeezed his hand. I would like that very much, she whispered. The fire cast its warm glow around them as they sat together. No longer two lost souls, but part of something larger, a community bound together by faith, hard work, and the simple power of acceptance. Through the window, the stars twinkled above their new barn frame, promising many more days of shared purpose and belonging. Snow drifted lazily past the cabin window as Sarah Miller and 3 other neighbor women gathered around Maria, pins held carefully between their lips. The simple white dress they were fitting hung loose in places, but their skilled hands worked quickly to make it perfect. Hold still now, Sarah murmured, adjusting the fabric at Maria's waist. You'll be the prettiest bride this meeting house has seen. Maria's eyes glistened. I never thought I'd have a proper wedding dress, she whispered, touching the clean cotton reverently. Across the homestead in the newly finished barn, Jacob practiced his vows while stacking fresh hay. His hands trembled slightly as he rehearsed the words that would bind them together before God and community. The familiar work helped steady his nerves. When wedding morning arrived, crisp and bright with fresh snow, the small Amish meeting house filled quickly. Townsfolk who had once whispered cruel words now sat quietly respectful. Neighbors who had helped rebuild the barn nodded warmly. Near the back, 3 native traders, who often passed through the settlement, sat wrapped in their winter blankets, having brought beautiful woven gifts to honor the couple. Bishop Eli Yoder stood at the front, his usual stern expression softened by what he had witnessed over these past weeks. Jacob entered first, his black suit brushed clean, hat held respectfully in his hands. When Maria appeared in her simple white dress, a collective murmur of appreciation rose from the gathering. Maria's steps faltered slightly as she approached, overwhelmed by all the eyes upon her. But Jacob reached out, taking her hand firmly in his. His quiet strength steadied her, just as it had since that first day at the train station. Friends, Bishop Yoder began, his voice carrying through the hushed room. We gather to witness God's handiwork in joining these 2 souls. He paused, looking directly at Jacob. Through faith and obedience, even in difficult times, This man has shown us that God's ways are higher than our own expectations." Maria's voice quivered as she spoke her vows, but her words rang clear with sincerity. Jacob's response came strong and sure, his hand never leaving hers as he pledged his life and love before their community. Soft singing filled the meeting house as they sealed their marriage with a modest kiss. Later, at their homestead, guests gathered for a simple feast. The cabin overflowed with warmth and good wishes as Maria, radiant despite her natural shyness, served bowls of hot stew and fresh bread to everyone. Women who had once turned away now embraced her as a sister. Men who had doubted Jacob's choice now clapped him on the shoulder in approval. "Welcome, wife," Jacob whispered when they had a quiet moment together. Maria's answering smile lit up her entire face as she took her place beside him. Finally, home. Snow lay thick across the Colorado Valley as December settled in. The rebuilt barn stood strong against winter storms, and warmth radiated from Jacob and Maria's cabin on Christmas Eve. Lamplight spilled golden through frosted windows as Maria stirred a large pot of stew on the cook stove. "More soup, Beth?" Maria smiled at the thin orphan girl who held up her bowl hopefully. The child nodded eagerly, and Maria filled it to the brim. Around their expanded table sat 3 widows from town and 5 children without homes, all gathered for the evening meal. Jacob watched from his place by the hearth, his heart full. Children's laughter mixed with the crackle of the fire as Maria moved among their guests, serving bread and comfort in equal measure. Her own joy seemed to fill the whole cabin, so different from the frightened girl who had stepped off the train months ago. "The Lord provides in ways we cannot imagine," he murmured, remembering his desperate prayers for a bride. Instead of just a wife, God had sent him a partner whose strength and tenderness daily amazed him. Through Maria, he had learned deeper courage and compassion than he'd known possible. After the meal, as their guests warmed themselves by the fire, Maria slipped her hand into Jacob's. "Who would have thought," she whispered, "that such a broken road could lead me home?" Her eyes shone with happy tears in the firelight. Jacob lifted her hand to his lips, kissing it gently. "With God," he said softly, "nothing is wasted. Even our hardest paths can lead to blessing." Together they bowed their heads in quiet prayer, their hearts peaceful and full. Outside, snow continued to fall softly in the darkness, but inside their cabin, love and mercy had built a warmth no winter could touch. Thanks for being here. If this story stirred something in you, a memory, a feeling, a truth, go ahead and subscribe. I'll be back tomorrow with another moment that just might speak to your soul.